Welcome to Ride to Success, the podcast that takes you on a learning journey to a more productive, creative, and active life. In the podcast, I explore cycling's global trends, community needs, and innovative business strategies. In this Ride to Success podcast episode, I chatted with Miles Baker-Clarke about diversity and inclusivity within the cycling industry. Miles is Head of Strategy and Creative at Fusion Media Agency. He has a rich background in marketing and a deep passion for cycling. He also brings a unique perspective on how to tackle the sport's long-standing diversity challenges. As the founder of Cycling Culture Club and a seasoned professional in cycling marketing, he shares his journey, insights, and hopes for making cycling a more welcoming and inclusive space for all. Join me in this learning journey as Miles sheds light on the transformative power of diversity in cycling and the path towards a more inclusive future. Now, before we get into the podcast, ladies and gentlemen, please remember to subscribe and review the podcast. It helps me grow immensely, and I'll be forever grateful. Now, back to the podcast. Welcome, Miles, to Ride to Success. It's a pleasure to have you on the podcast.
Thanks for having me, Pedro. Appreciate the invite.
Pleasure. I wanted to start by acknowledging that both our loves for cycling, we both enjoy riding our bikes. We take great pleasure in it. Cycling itself has been growing in popularity for the last years, yet there is a problem of diversity and inclusivity in the sport that we both enjoy taking part in, and as well in the industry that we both work in. This itself is not necessarily any breaking news. We both know that there's been a problem with diversity and inclusivity in the industry and in the sport. And I want to use this as a framing for our conversation because it's quite relevant to our discussion, to the work that you have been doing, that we will be talking later on. But first, I wanted to take a few steps back, and if you will, please share what has been your fondest memory. That is cycling-related fondest memory, kind of what inspired you to just appreciate even more the pleasure of cycling.
Yeah, so I think I get asked this a fair bit, and it's always tricky to nail down just one, but where I always come back to is the first time I ever took my bike to the mountains, because it's just an unreal experience, right? You know, they're incredible, both sort of visually, but also from a challenge perspective. And, you know, you get a couple of friends together, you take your bikes to the mountains and you have a great time. If you're lucky enough, you get to see some racing while you're there, and it's just the most memorable experiences. You know, I've got images, I've got really, really good memories, despite them being like super, super tough as challenges. I think there's in cycling, we have that beauty of overcoming challenges, and I think that's why the mountains will never lie, because there's so much you can gain from them.
Do you have can you pinpoint a precise location where this memory takes you back to?
Yeah, I sort of vaguely remember all of the routes that I've done over the years, but I spent quite a lot of time in and around Alpe d'Huez, so Bourg-d'Oisans, and I distinctly remember one moment of climbing the Col de Croix de Fer, which is in and around that region, and I remember there being an absolutely blisteringly hot day, like really hot, and me and the friends that were with me sort of stopped halfway, 3/4 of the way up, and like dunked our heads in a cattle trough, and just let that water like sort of run down our faces and bodies, and it was just like, I remember that feeling of relief on such a hot day. And there's a particular photo that I've got somewhere by this trough and this incredibly hot and beautiful surrounding. And if you've never been to that sort of place, Pedro, I'd really recommend it. Like it's just incredible.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I haven't been. Someday it's one of those bucket lists moments that you really have to take the time to go to. But mountains in cycling is just mythical. They inspire so many stories. And I personally, that's one of when I go, for instance, to Portugal, I try to spend time in the mountains, north of Portugal, where it's just just like riding there, because that's where I come from. But that's beyond the point. I just enjoy riding and just challenging myself as well. So, I mean, it's I wanted to. Obviously you have kind of you have perhaps experienced certain difficulties that I haven't experienced, and I just wanted to delve into that because I think it's relevant. Have you ever experienced any barriers that you have faced in coming into the sport of cycling? Is there ever been,
most definitely,
from your experience,
I'm
personal
not sure I'd
experience,
actually
any
use the word
barriers that you
barriers
have
because I feel like
experienced?
it does a little bit of a disservice to
Okay.
some who have experienced real barriers. But I tell you what, I've been aware of the entire time I've been a cyclist, or what I'd consider a cyclist, and that is that there are very few people, or at least there are where I live, who actually look like me. Now, this is not a unique problem. People around the world have felt this for generations. But what I found when I joined cycling, and it was quite profound at the time, it was actually there isn't anyone in this sport who looks like me. And that's what I felt at the time, however accurate. And the challenge with that is if you're even remotely unsure about your pursuit into cycling, then what do you think happens when you come into something and you don't see anyone that looks like yourself? You potentially find yourself alienated, and then once you're alienated, it's very easy to just fall straight back out of cycling. So I think, so where I'm, just for a little bit of added context, so I live in Tunbridge Wells in Kent now, and isn't anybody else in the club, even now, who looks like me. So this was something I noticed. It was something I was aware of. It was even something that was commented on at times, but it never really deterred me because I met a great bunch of people, made some really great friends, and perhaps I was resilient enough to it to sort of continue anyway. Now, the challenge with that approach is you're very reliant on someone being strong-willed enough to sort of crack through that, and I truly don't think they should have to. So that's definitely, from a sporting perspective, from a community perspective, that's definitely a barrier. As I say, like, people have had it a lot worse than me, but that's just something I've always noticed. On the sort of the other side, so on the industry side, it's not much better considering, the size of the industry relative to the number of people in it. Like the diversity level is seriously poor. And there's been some attempts to sort of make that better, but I think they've been a little bit top level for my liking, and I won't name names, but there are some organizations that have tried and are trying, but I still think there's room for improvement. Because in the same way that, I talk about my cycling club and joining and not seeing anyone that looks like me, in my industry, I struggle to count on, one hand the people in cycling marketing who look like me. There are some, but there's really not many. So it was that sort of realization that really started to make me look a little bit harder at what was going on in the industry. And, the company where I currently work made that possible because a lot of the work we do is aimed at being purposeful. How do we make change in industries that we care about? So I was given some time to really look into it and really sort of think about it. And, I spent many a night on the phone with friends talking about, their perspectives and what they thought needed to change and how they thought we could change it, and etc. And these were conversations across the world, people not just, here in England or in London, but, in LA and Germany and all over. So I think, does cycling have a diversity problem? Yes. But there are spring shoots. You look at London's diversity in the cycling scene, and it's phenomenal. There's a real range of riders, every shape, every size, every color, every creed. And I find that just such a safe haven for feeling represented and feeling connected. And it's just a shame I don't live in London, but it's just one of those things where if that can start to spread out from the city, then I think we can see some real difference.
Yeah, that's an important point to mention. Cycling in London, yes, is very multicultural. There's a lot of diversity, but having said that, London itself is very multicultural, is very diverse. There is different cycling clubs, community groups taking upon themselves to making that effort to make it cycling more inclusive, to welcome people that are not well represented within the sport, to feel more welcomed. And I think that's perhaps it's it's um it's a tale of what needs to happen in other places, because yes, I guess London creates the right atmosphere, the right conditions for that to happen because of the nature of the city itself. But as you mentioned, from the example that you gave of the club that you are a member of, that is not very much the case that happens outside London. I don't want to generalize here because that's a that's a slippery slope. But let's just use the your example. From the experience in your cycling club, I mean, obviously you are still in the cycling club, so I'm assuming that you are still welcome and you feel very much part of the community. Do you feel that there's still the club itself that you're a member of could be doing more, or are you actively involved in making sure that there is being done more to welcome more members that are less represented within the cycling club?
I mean, part of the reason I'm still with them is because,
Mm.
well, I made some good friends there, but also I sort of jumped in with both feet. So I joined the committee. I wanted to be close to the decision makers and see if I could make a difference at that level. And to be honest, they've been very receptive, very open to ideas, open to new strategies. Unfortunately, I think, and this will be the problem for a lot of other places too, they're a victim of the demographic makeup of the area. You know,
Yeah.
where I live is not terribly diverse anyway. So then when you boil that down into the niche of cycling, it's even less so. So it's not overly surprising that there's not a huge amount of diversity in the club. And I don't think it's necessarily their fault.
Mm-hmm.
Could we do better to showcase riders from other backgrounds? Absolutely. But the problem is there's very few riders in the area who are of that background. And if they are, then
Yeah.
we're not aware of them or they're not aware of us. And that's part of the reason why
Exactly. Yeah.
we could do better.
Unfortunately, that's yeah, it's perhaps symptomatic of a bigger problem of representation in the media, not just for cycling, but perhaps in the bigger context of how minorities are represented, perhaps. And I kind of wanted to, because you have been working in the industry, and I wanted to kind of let's focus on the industry for now. Can you pinpoint what is now currently lacking that can be addressed, and present opportunities to be improved in terms of representation of ethnic minorities, for instance?
Can I pinpoint it? Yes, in certain instances. So I
Okay.
think brands have sort of tiptoed into this world probably since, you know, George Floyd's murder. And it became a buzzword, right? It became something that if
Yeah.
you were in marketing, you had to consider. And while, so the cynic in me would argue that it's all for the sake of marketing, I do think it did make some difference for the positive. It at least made people aware of some of the failings of the industry. So
Yeah.
that's just in terms of sort of content and visual representation. And I think that is in a better place. What I think there's a couple of intrinsic issues actually.
Mm-hmm.
I think firstly, and it's not to do with cycling, and it's not cycling sport specifically, but in terms of encouraging people from ethnic minorities to enter the marketing and creative sphere, I think that's not really happening. sort of baseline educational level. So if you take it back to school, I don't think enough of that is happening in the schools in the UK. That means
Okay.
that people aren't working their way up as much through that system and ending up in marketing and creative roles. Of course, I'm generalizing. I don't claim to be
Yeah.
an expert into this, but I think that's definitely my experience. You know, there was no encouragement from my educational superiors to actually head down that route. I just happened to do it because I had creative parents and stuff.
Yeah.
I think that's the first thing, and that's not something cycling's going to change. But the other thing is it's a bit of a self-perpetuating cycle where if you have somebody that works in marketing who is an ethnic minority or diverse for some other reason, people see that person and they feel, oh, actually, you know, someone who is like me from my background or similar background
Mm-hmm.
can make it in this space and might make different decisions than they would have otherwise. So I think that's super key, and
Exactly. Yeah. Yeah.
it's why I've been really sort of not vocal. I'm not sure vocal's the word, but I've not shied away from, you know, some of the work that I've been doing, and I've really tried to champion those in the community and in other groups and in other industries who are doing great work to keep doing it because it makes a massive difference. So there's companies like the North Face who run an allyship program.
Yeah.
So they run a really good online course, about an hour, and it goes through how you spot and how you cultivate allies in the workplace for people from diverse backgrounds.
Oh,
Super interesting, free.
yeah.
Recommend it to everyone. And I think what that does is it encourages those who are interested in making a difference to make some different choices to help that happen. So really, what I mean is that's got to speak to the hiring managers. That's got to speak to the senior management of some of these companies to change the way or adjust the way that they view their hiring process.
Yeah,
Maybe
for sure.
where they're hiring. You know, could you put out
Hmm.
ads in specific parts of London where you know there are, you know, particular groups of community? And I think that sort of institutional change takes a long time to happen, but is going to be really important to the growth of diversity in cycling. The second part is those that are from a diverse background within cycling need to band together to spread the word because that's the only way we really make a difference on the ground. So hence the work I've been doing. You know, it's about actually how do I connect with individuals who are all super passionate about the same thing to actually make this a bigger voice as a whole. And I mean, I'm sure you know, but there are some fantastic initiatives to get, you know, people of color or people of neurodivergence or, you know, every other sort of diversity vertical you want to look at. There are groups who cater to these people.
Yeah.
The problem with each of them is they're only, you know, they're run by volunteers largely, and they only have so much bandwidth to spread the word. So that's why I think we as an industry can help support those platforms, whether that's financially, whether that's through, you know, employment, whether that's just through, you know, for us, it's about dedicating agency time to initiatives where we think there's real importance.
Exactly. Yeah.
Stuff like that on a, you know, if you imagine that extrapolated across some of the bigger companies in our industry, you could start to see some real difference.
Yeah. There is. I mean, there is. There has been data that's been widely available. Well, speaking, referencing a recent report from Bicycle Association, but there are many others reports readily available online that demonstrate that having a more diverse leadership, but workforce as well, makes your business more profitable. And this is in the order of 40% plus. But also the fact that you having a more diverse workforce, it just makes for better decisions as well. And that's kind of, you mentioned about the groups that are mostly perhaps volunteer led, and yeah, there is a key aspect that this needs to be changed in terms of at leadership level, but also at grassroots levels, because if it's only happening at grassroots level, people will, they might get involved. They see there is the benefit. Obviously, this is not up to discussion. There is the benefit, but then they don't see change happening because the leadership, the people in the leadership positions, they don't. It's not relatable to them, perhaps. So that there needs to be people at the top that also can make the right decisions. And there is, as you mentioned, there are companies that are already making strides in that field to make their teams more diverse, but also that how they interact with the customers, how they speak to the public in general, in a more richer way, rather than just being very white male orientated communications, especially in the cycling industry. And I kind of wanted as well, because we've been talking about the sort of the cycling industry, but there's also an important point. I think it's to mention the aspect of role models. You have started, you founded a cycling culture club, which I'll let you explain what it is for people that don't know about it. But it gives a voice to people from ethnic minorities, from diverse backgrounds, to share their stories. And I think that's so very important, to be able to give a platform to share the knowledge, and make it more welcoming. So can you just share what is the vision?
You've given it quite
okay.
boilerplate introduction, but I suppose the reasons why I created Cycling Culture Club was that I felt like, coming from a career based in media at the moment, there's a real lack of representation in media. And I think many of us as cyclists would consider the media our sort of main source of information and news when it comes to cycling, and be that for sport, be that for leisure, be that for product, whatever. And there are very few, again, probably on one hand, I can count the amount of cycling journalists of colour in our industry. So that was my initial discovery, and the bit that I found quite perplexing initially. So that was the first thing. I was like, if I can't find someone whose voice I can relate to on a personal level, then isn't that something I'm missing? So then I started thinking, okay, this is just not just a media opportunity. This could also be an opportunity for communities to share their voices, for people to share their stories. And what started out as me having an outlet to share my stories grew quite rapidly into a collective of people who can share their stories. So Cycling Culture Club has become, and hopefully will continue to become, a place for underrepresented groups to come and find others that look or are like them, give them a home to share their stories, be that, whatever they want to put forward, be that, creativity, be that writing, be that video or photos or podcasting or whatever it might be, a safe space for people who don't have another safe space in our industry, with which to have a voice. And I think that was what was really important to me. Now, I'll be honest, I don't exactly know where Cycling Culture Club will go in the long term. I think short term, I've got a fairly good idea of where I want to get it to, but I know a couple of things. I know, firstly, that I want it to eventually grow far beyond me and not be limited by my time, but instead be a global initiative that brings people together across the world. And I think, secondly, I want it to be a directory for community groups and initiatives across the world in all various countries, where people can go to for advice, where they can sort of plug in their destination and find groups locally to them where they can go and feel like they belong. And I think that's really testament to what I was lacking when I joined cycling. It was like,
Yeah,
I don't know there's nowhere I can go where I feel like there are other cyclists who look like me. Now, it's a different world now. In London, I can find, I know dozens and dozens of people, and many of them are my contributors for Cycling Culture Club. But when I was first
that's how it starts.
yeah, exactly. Many of them were along a similar journey to me 10 years ago, and for whatever reason they stuck it out and are now part of this community. So now I want to bring those guys together and let all of them know that each other exists as well, because pockets of people will know each other, of course, but there's so many people that I've met through the work I've been doing with amazing characters and incredible will to make change and stuff, and I've been inspired time and time again by people who are doing fantastic work. So I think that's the other point to pinpoint for the Cycling Culture Club to really become what I want it to be. It's to allow it to spotlight the good work that other people are doing. It doesn't need to be a brand in of itself. There's nothing but no ego wrapped up in that. It's all about actually, how does this become a platform where people like me can feel, welcome at home, accepted,
Yeah,
free to share whatever they want to share.
yeah. It sounds. I mean, it's. I mean, that's one of the reasons I wanted to bring you on the podcast, because I wanted to give you the platform to share, and do the little that I can to also spread the word, help in that regard. But I think it also goes much more beyond just sharing. It gives the Cycling Culture Club. It's a place where, well, from what I understand, obviously, that's my understanding. What I understand is that people can connect, people can share their stories, and have a pool of resources that make them feel connected with each other around the world, in a way that, I mean, yes, you can do it via social media, but it's perhaps more intimate. Does that is that an approximation of what it is, or or am I far off?
No, you're pretty much there, and I think, yeah, you sort of hit the nail on the head when you mention finding the resources together, right? And that word resource can be a bit sort of, can go down several alleyways, right? In the context of Cycling Culture Club, I think those resources are human connection. I think they are as tangible and realistic as actual resource. So if you wanted to find a black photographer for a shoot that you wanted to do, I can recommend someone, the literal term. But then I think that also, it will become a resource for people to find these initiatives where they can feel at home. So I'm not there yet, and I will get there. But I'd love to be able to arrive in a country, pop a postcode in, and it spit out 5 different community groups I can get in touch with, or people in the local area. That's where I'd like to get to, because then I feel like there's a pathway for anyone to find their way in cycling, whereas otherwise I think you're sort of left to your own devices. You're sort of reliant on being taken under the wing of a friend, or finding a group who resonates with your background, and that feels like a little bit too much like chance to me.
Yeah, definitely. I agree. For instance, to give you an example, the woman that I've been speaking, for instance, I have the founders of Limitless Festival, mountain biking festival in Scotland, in the podcast. Other guests that will come in due time, will released. They share the fact that they could go to the club, their club next door to them, but they don't feel like they will be very welcome, or if they are welcome, they don't feel like there's enough of women there, or other black people there, and that kind of puts them off. And it's not necessarily because the club or the ride, the people were not welcoming, but there isn't perhaps a, the fact that you don't see someone that looks like you, or it maybe puts you off. And like you said, to pointing to the example that you mentioned, you kind of jumped straight into the pool in your example of the going into the club. You dived head in. But some people might not feel the confidence to do that. And from the examples and conversations I had with women, more specifically, they mentioned that sometimes they have to drive 1 hour, 1 or 2 hours to go and find that woman's ride that that means a lot to them, because they can feel that there is a group that is nurturing. They feel that there is trust within the group, and it's a group of women. And in the case, it can be, as this applies to any ethnic minority. It is the representation. That's what I'm got a long-winded argument, but is the representation that I'm trying to get to. And that also brings me to the role models. Perhaps this is something that you're trying to achieve with the Cycling Culture Club as well. Give a platform for role models to form and inspire younger generations of people that feel interested in coming to the sport, and having that resource. They are easily, not easily, but they feel that they have the tools to connect with people that can speak to them. I mean, with the sport in general, you have also a problem of diversity. Do you think that affects how cycling is perceived?
You mean perceived by people from diverse
By
backgrounds?
Yes, yeah,
Yeah, absolutely. So I think of it in football. Probably one of the best examples for this, because representation in football is generally pretty good. And I think there's a couple of reasons for that. I think barriers to entry at the very grassroots level are pretty low. Get away with some trainers and a pair of football boots is not a massive outlay for most. So again, generalizing, but I think that allows more people into the sport, and that allows for just better odds when it comes to someone from an ethnic background to actually find their way to the top of that sport. Now, in cycling, it couldn't be further from that.
mm-hmm.
The most basic bike
Yeah,
is still going to cost you £300, £400, £500. You might get lucky used, but for some families, that's that's a huge amount of money.
That's too much. Yeah.
And particularly if that child is not an only child, and you've got a couple of kids who have passions that they want to follow and stuff, and how do you make that happen if you're not in an affluent household? So I think that's one of the first things. It starts really early on. Like, can you nurture that child to get into cycling enough that they stay in cycling? And the chances are that at the moment, that's a real challenge, because you made reference to the BA data earlier, but one of the other things that came out in data recently was kids' bike sales had fallen off a cliff. And that's always a real red flag, because it's like, if people aren't buying kids' bikes, then how are kids getting on bikes, and how are kids discovering the joy of cycling like we did when we were kids? So I think that's a real concern, and that's just aside from the diversity thing. Anyway, taking it back to professional cycling, and I think you've got such a small pool of riders at the top level of the sport who come from a diverse background, and I don't just mean black people. That is definitely a thing, but there's also a lack of Asian people at the top of the sport. There's loads of underrepresented groups in pro cycling.
Yeah.
And if you're a child from a non-cycling nation looking up to professional riders, and you can't see anybody that looks like you, that is a massive issue. Even if it doesn't come across in the short term, that psychologically might dampen your confidence to push forward to get to where you can
definitely.
be. And that's an absolute issue. Now, I've sort of touched upon why I think we struggle to bring ethnic minorities up through the sport. It is a very expensive sport, and I don't think we're going to change that in the short term. But what I've loved seeing is some great initiatives that break down those barriers for some of these kids and some of these young people. So, like Team Armani, for example,
Yeah.
really great guys doing some really great stuff over there. I should link you up with Michael actually, because he'd be a great guest. But what
Thanks.
he's been doing for riders in East Africa and Kenya is actually giving them opportunities to train at the top of their sport, to ride the best equipment, and to ultimately race in European or American races. An advantage and an opportunity that none of them would ever have dreamed of without team's intervention. Now, that's all because there's been some generous funding from various brands. There's been some bloody hard work from people like Michael and the team around him. But that is an exact example of a group that, with some intervention and with some hard work and graft and some funding, you can make a difference to a team of people's lives. And that is just one of many examples. So I think what they show with Team Armani is what's possible. What we now have to look at is, how do we do more of that and make more of the same? How do we get more people to support grassroots cycling in general, like not just about bringing people of diversity through, but how do we ensure that people come through, period? That's a real important thing that we have to get through. But in terms of underrepresented riders, seeing those role models at the top of the sport is, it's such an intrinsic part of feeling your own self-worth and feeling like it's possible for you to get there. I'm plenty old enough, by no means a young person anymore, but I remember when I saw Biniam Gamay win Gent Wevelgem a few years ago, and I distinctly remember that as a moment of it was just hugely cathartic, because I remember thinking, I can't remember in recent memory having ever seen a black man cross the line with his hands in the air in pro cycling. And that was just massive for me. And others have obviously followed in his wake, and others have been successful, Tekla Hymenot and folks like Justin Williams who do their own good work in their own spaces. But all of that is super powerful. And for me personally, there's been a huge amount of inspiration taken from these individuals who have battled through that system to get where they are. And I think the more we can allow those people and give them the resources to get to that top of the sport, the more we'll encourage the young people of the next generation to take up cycling of all shapes and colours and creeds, so that the next generation is more diverse. And I think there's some countries that are doing it really quite well. So you look at what the UAE are doing, for example. Now, say what you want about the UAE, I won't get into that now, but when I was in the UAE in January, that my one massive takeaway was there are so many brown people on bikes there, like so many. Like, it was amazing to see. It was so inspiring. And what they've done there is they've encouraged the youth system to build these kids up and these young people up to believe they can be at the top of the sport. And now they're going for it. And slowly but surely, we're seeing some of those Emirati riders like coming up through the system, and there's a few now on UAE Team Emirates, and there's a few on UAE Team ADQ, the female team, and you can start to see that working. Now, again, the UAE is a complex situation, and they've got the advantage of being slightly more wealthy, which helps. But regardless, I think they do a good job, and it was inspiring to see those young kids like aspiring to be the next Pogacar, and that's, why shouldn't they be?
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. I mean, it's when you have a clear framework, and when a kid that is riding their bike can see that there is a clear path to reach top level of the sport, they can see, and they also as well, when they can see role models, it's easier for them to create that progression, to bring more diverse cohort of children into the sport, into enjoying riding their bikes and seeing that it's a career potentially in the sport. And you can see that the example you mentioned about football, a very good example where you have academies, where you have community clubs, many divisions. There is a clear framework, there's clear steps that this child can see in ahead of them, and obviously the support that comes with it. But that's the financial support is obviously in a different scale to what we have in cycling. But when they see themselves in the role models, and you have the steps laid out in front of me, then there is a potential. Obviously, what you mentioned about the barrier to entry with the cost of bikes, that's a reality that it's kind of difficult, to perhaps overcome that without the support, local government support, local charities. I know Cycling UK that is doing great work with the scheme to loan bikes for a month or so to just people that want to try and ride a bike. And they target for people of minority communities in across England, as well in Scotland, I believe. So yeah, there is some work being done, and that we need to praise that. But yes, there is still, in comparison to other sports, perhaps we are still miles behind.
We can't lose hope, though, Pedro.
No.
As you say, there are organisations, dozens of them, doing great work, and charities, and even individuals who have put aside, money or time or a mixture of the both to make a difference. And
yeah,
I think that's the one message I'm trying to get out there, is just like, it's not all doom and gloom. Like, we've made some amazing progress. There's still more work to be done, but I think we're heading in the right direction. The bit that frustrates me is when you see groups who are talking about doing certain things, talking about making strides and making difference, but sometimes I feel like they're not qualified to make said decisions or said statements.
Okay.
And I say that because, there might be a group of 15 people, and of those people, there's only one ethnically diverse person, or two maybe, which makes me think, like, what do you really know? What can you really surmise about the difference between not even you and me, because it's not even a fair thing. You're from Portugal, and for all I know, been through your own levels of struggle. But I think I like to see an acknowledgement that we don't have all the answers, but we're speaking to the right people to get them, rather than sort of labeling themselves as the experts and hoping to resonate with an audience who is not them. So I've been super mindful of that. It's the same thing, like battling with this idea that, cycling culture clubs should be just for black people, or should be just for certain people, and should exclude all others and all that. And I don't think it should be any of those things. I think it should be a place for people to share their stories. But my focus will and always will be on those who are from underrepresented groups. But if you look through my roster of contributors, there's a real mix of people, and not everyone is black.
Yeah, there is,
Not everyone is male. Not everyone is female. There are folks in there with disabilities. You can't even see what's necessarily been their struggle. And that's what I love about it. I want people to look upon that list and go, oh, okay, there's something here for me. And I think that's what
exactly
all organisations can take as a good framework to start off, from my humble perspective.
No, that's important to share. So I think that leads me nicely on to, you are kind of you've touched upon this, but I wanted to ask you anyway. Looking ahead, what are your hopes for the future of cycling in terms of diversity, inclusivity, and representation?
Question. It's a very good question. I haven't given it a huge amount of thought, but I think I would love for the next generation. So if we consider the next generation being, young kids at this stage, I would love to think that in 10, 15 years' time, we'll be many percentiles better from a diversity perspective within cycling. And I mean all forms of cycling as well, not just the sort of cycling that you and I do, but, using a bike for leisure should be as much a priority as using a bike for sport. But what I hope is that next generation feels like that could be something they can, appeal to. They can aspire to, rather. And I think that's achievable. I really do. But I would also like to see some intervention from the industry, from the government, from groups in power to actually help drive that. So through the trying to avoid being self-serving, but I've worked on projects like Bike is Best, which is a consumer-facing campaign to get more people on bikes, and the big focus throughout all of our campaign work there was actually showcasing that cyclists can look like anyone, that anyone could be a cyclist. And
exactly,
we always really hyper-focused on that diversity angle in the content, in the visuals. And I think that's something that we could all learn from, and that's something that we can all aspire to improve. But I think part of what is going to really make the difference in the cycling industry now, not necessarily in cycling as a sport, but is having more decision makers who are either from ethnically diverse backgrounds, or in the short term are simply allies for that push towards that end goal. Because you've got to be realistic. Like, we can't click our fingers and magically make more black people in cycling. Like, it's not going to happen. But if we can encourage more people from all backgrounds to become allies of that cause, then what you get is the more decision makers in the biggest companies in cycling to be making that making those decisions, and those hiring decisions, and those apprenticeship decisions, and all of those little initiatives that help bring people through. And I strongly believe, and I'd hang my hat on it, that if we can make many more allies, then the next generation will stand a much greater chance of being better than my generation.
That's a very good answer. I hope that it's important to share that message, and I hope that people listening will feel inspired to also look to their immediate areas, their immediate place of work, their communities, and think as well of what can I do to try to perhaps make a change, or try to make it more inclusive. At least give some thought, because that in itself makes you think, makes you reflect. So thanks for sharing that, because I think it's important to be said.
Yeah. I mean, just really quickly, as a follow-up, I think if there's one thing you can do, and if someone listening is feeling like, oh yeah, I wonder how I'd make a difference, I'd say it's not being afraid to ask questions, and not being afraid that you're going to sort of offend someone to the point where you don't ask those questions. Like, there's a way of doing it, I'll admit, but most people who you're likely to be surrounding yourself with are going to be happy to take an open and honest question about how they are more sensitive to subjects around diversity. It's not an easy subject. There's the reason why there's courses, and there's a reason why people like Anila McKenna, who's doing great work, have thriving careers, because people need that guidance, and that's a fact. But I think the simplest thing that most people can do even someone you don't know all that well, like drop them a message and slide into their DMs and say, hey, listen, I'm really interested about this. What can I do about it? And if anybody wants to do the same to me, then I'm more than happy to share what little knowledge I have on the subject and point them in the direction of people who are much more knowledgeable than myself.
Yeah. I'll link all your socials on the comments of the on the description of the podcast. I started the podcast, and I need to ask this question, and you can broaden your answer as much as you want, or your narrow it as much as you want, but it needs to be asked: what does success look like to you?
So success for me is about fulfillment. I'm not a money-driven person. I'm not a materially driven person. I know I have nice bikes, but I worked in media for years, so swings and roundabouts. For me, it's about how do I leave a mark on the things that I do. How do I ensure everything I do is the best work I can possibly do. So success for me is feeling like I can give something back. I can help someone grow. I can help someone get where they need to be. And that could be a client in professional life, or in personal life, it could be, helping a friend, or, making sure my wife feels supported in her own career and all that sort of stuff. And I think, as much as it's a fluffy answer, I think success for me is my effect on those around me. Less about something that I'm going to achieve for myself.
That's a very good answer. I guess it circles back to the purpose that you have. The purpose that you have starting Cycling Culture Club, the purpose that you have in creating that platform to bring people together, but also to help the people around you. So it comes back to the purpose that you have in life.
Good. Can I ask you the same question?
What does success look like to me?
Yeah.
It looks like being able to be on a learning journey, constantly progressing forward. That's what success is for me. It's in various aspects of my life. So whether it is my personal life with my partner, it's growing that relationship with my partner, whether that is in cycling, just trying to be a little bit better every time. And at work as well, is just trying to be able to connect with the people that I work with, and have build those relationships, have connections that are meaningful. And if I'm learning as well in the process, makes it even better. So I guess it brings me now to the point of the podcast. There's a tradition that I started, which involves every guest leaves a question to my next guest, not knowing who they are. So the question that was left for you, what is one of the most exciting opportunities in cycling now for people first getting into the sport?
I think it's the chance to make history. And to expand upon that, I think what I'm hoping, and it ties to my to what I hope for cycling in your previous question, but what I'm hoping is, as we move forward, more and more people from diverse backgrounds, from different countries, from different walks of life, and all over the world can actually enter cycling, and therefore you start to get new firsts. For the first time in a long time, you get some real new firsts. The first women's Paris-Roubaix. At some point, I hope we have the first black winner of the Tour de France. At one point you'll have the first 19-year-old Colombian or something winning Milan-San Remo or whatever. And I think that's what's really exciting, right? Like that, we can only get better, I hope, from where we are now. We can only head in the right direction.
So, yeah.
So I think that opportunity for what comes next is what really excites me.
Very good. That's a very good answer. So I guess now it's your turn to put someone else on the spot. Okay. What question would you like to leave for my next guest?
So what do I want to ask? I think I want to ask if you could ask one question of a leader within cycling, what would it be? So when I say a leader in cycling, someone like David Lepatien from the UCI. If you could ask him one question, or Dave Brailsford, or Tadej Pogacar is arguably a leader in cycling. But if you could ask a leader in cycling of your choosing one question, what would it be and why?
That's a very good way of turning the question. That's a good spin. I like it. It's the first time I've heard it in the podcast, in the Right to Success podcast. So yeah, it's the first year. Well done. It's a great question to leave to my next guest. With that, Miles, it's been great. I'm learning through your experience, through the insights that you've shared. I hope that the podcast also is able to touch people listening and make them think about what you said and reflect on what can be done differently. So thank you for coming on the podcast.
Thanks, Pedro. No, thanks for having me and for listening to me waddle on. But no, I appreciate what you're doing and I wish you luck with it. And I look forward to hearing how the next guest answers my question.
Wow, what an insightful conversation with Miles. He sheds a light on the persistent diversity issues within cycling and offers a roadmap towards a more inclusive future. Through initiatives like the Cycling Culture Club and his call to action for the industry, he's not just dreaming of change, he's spearheading it. And as the cycling world continues to evolve, it's voices and actions of individuals like Miles that will ensure the sport is as diverse and as vibrant as it needs to be. Now, before you go, please remember to leave us a review. 5 stars would be awesome. And remember to tune in to my next week's episode where Miles' questions will be answered by my next guest. Until then, thanks for listening.